At 34, Ted considered himself both fortunate and successful. He was the head of a large company that sold components and spare parts for various types of equipment, and he lived in a luxurious 2-level apartment in the city center. His life was, in a word, idyllic. However, there was a downside to his happiness that Ted chose not to dwell on. The foundation of his prosperity was the capital earned by his father-in-law, Allison's father, not him. Ted reassured himself that few people could achieve such success at his age, regardless of how it was acquired. Ted was born and raised in the working outskirts of the city. His family consisted of a perpetually tired mother who single-handedly raised 2 children and an older brother who was lazy and avoided his studies from a young age. Compared to his brother, Ted was considered more capable, knowledgeable, and promising, and hence the minimal expectations placed on him. Ted grew up almost entirely by himself. He didn't cause much trouble, and from a young age he knew he needed to escape the crowded suburb. He searched for ways to achieve this, sometimes even against common sense. Ted's academic performances were average, but he excelled in the humanities more than in exact and natural sciences. His mother, always on the brink of poverty, couldn't afford tutors. As a result, Ted struggled with subjects like algebra, geometry, physics, and chemistry. However, after school, he chose to become an electrician and managed to enroll in a relevant school. His studies didn't go too well, as he was often distracted by his attention to the girls. The girls he was dating were similar to him, young, carefree, and not overly concerned with moral values. They enjoyed their time together without making any long-term plans or considering starting a family. Around this time, Ted's older brother committed a serious crime, not just a minor prank. He and his friends robbed a home appliance store, for which he was sentenced to prison. Their mother, in an attempt to help her older son, sold her small apartment and used the proceeds to buy a tiny studio in an old apartment building in the same neighborhood. She gave the rest of the money to a lawyer in hopes of appealing the case. Unfortunately, whether she was misled or the lawyer was incompetent, nothing changed. The older son remained in prison, and it became clear to Ted that there was no space for him at home. Thus, he realized that adulthood had begun for him, whether he was ready for it or not. Ted began working at an early age, taking on any jobs he could. He started by carrying crates of fruits and vegetables to the market for a few pennies. He helped unload trucks full of household chemicals and walked dogs for others. He also distributed leaflets and handed out advertisements on the streets as a promoter. Despite trying to balance these jobs with his studies, his academic success was getting worse. However, with difficulty, he did graduate from school. Ted landed his first official job at a local enterprise. Although the pay was not substantial, especially for a novice specialist, it was enough for him to get by. The problem was that he could no longer use the student dormitory, so he needed to find his own place to live and pay rent. With his first paycheck, Ted rented a tiny room in a shared apartment. The rest of his earnings were quickly spent. This rash expenditure was a one-time event afterwards. He began to work and manage his finances more wisely, eventually saving some money for the first time in his life. Despite his efforts, Ted struggled with his personal life. The women he liked would go on a few dates with him, but then they often stopped communication or didn't respond to his calls. Aware of his financial limitations, Ted understood that he couldn't fulfill the expectations of many women. He could only afford to dine out once a month and seldom bought flowers or gifts, which women tend to appreciate. Ted knew that if he lowered his standards and dated not marshmallow air creatures but girls from his circle, or even from work, he might have more success. He tried this a couple of times but was quickly disappointed. He believed he deserved more than ignorant women who often neglected their appearance and used foul language. So Ted remained single, continuing his search for a significant other. He lived this way for about 2 years. During this time, he got used to the fact that he could safely provide himself not only with a place to live but also with good food, clothes in season, and a little entertainment. He even had some free time. In his little world, Ted was happy. However, soon everything started to fall apart with alarming speed. The company that once provided a young man with employment and income suddenly collapsed. It was revealed that the owner owed a significant amount of money, and had only selectively paid taxes. Soon, law enforcement agents visited the company. Within a week of this event, Ted, along with many of his colleagues, found himself jobless and lost his income, which he needed for rent and food. Ted began job hunting, but luck was not on his side. He was willing to work as an electrician but could not secure a position due to stiff competition. Potential employers considered him too young and unpromising, preferring more experienced candidates. Eventually, Ted took a job at a construction site, hoping to work as an electrician. However, he was only accepted as a helper. He worked there for a week until payday. Instead of receiving his earned money, Ted was given a promise and reassurance that he would be paid soon. This was not what Ted had anticipated, as he had been eagerly waiting for his paycheck while surviving on meager resources. Chance decided his fate. One day, with only some change in his pocket, Ted wandered through a snowy park, torn about what to do. He had almost no money left, and if he didn't get paid again, it would be a disaster. His mother offered no help. She made it clear that he was on his own, as she was already burdened with feeding herself and his incarcerated older brother. In her eyes, Ted was an adult who had to fend for himself. His work troubles were unimportant to her compared to the mess his brother had gotten himself into. As Ted thought over his options, a small dog darted past him, its leash trailing behind. The incident happened so quickly that Ted barely had time to register it. He just noticed the dog's pink jacket and surmised that it must belong to a well-off woman, having seen similar dogs while walking other people's pets for a small fee. The owner soon arrived, a tall, slender girl dressed elegantly but not ostentatiously. Ted assessed this stranger with a keen eye and immediately stepped aside so as not to obstruct her path. He realized at first glance that this girl was out of his league. She was too fashionable, too affluent, and too wealthy for a simple laborer like him. Regardless, he wished he could engage in conversation with her. She had an open face, a kind look, and a pleasant appearance. As she approached, it became clear that she was quite young, no older than 20 years old. When she spoke, Ted was taken aback. "Hello, could you tell me where the dog in the pink overalls ran off to?" She slipped the leash and ran away. The girl spoke calmly, slightly out of breath from her brisk walk, but without the haughtiness often displayed by girls of her status. Ted, of course, was eager to assist, showing her where the dog had run. After hearing her hurried thanks, he plucked up the courage to offer further help. "Do you need help finding your dog?" "I have experience communicating with dogs." He didn't wait for a response and instead headed in the direction where the small dog in pink overalls had run off, although it was certainly not the dog that occupied his attention, but its owner. The girl, a head shorter than Ted, accompanied him. Her eyes were continuously scanning the surroundings for her pet. Delicate and captivating, she was quiet throughout, whether due to her reserved nature or preoccupation with her missing dog. Ted too remained silent, worried that a wrong move might ruin the connection they formed over the past few minutes, a bond built on their shared mission to find her runaway pet. As their search yielded no results, Ted found himself hoping for the search in the park to extend. Perhaps then he could strike up a conversation with his charming companion and get to know her better. The idea of asking for her phone number didn't even occur to him. He wouldn't dare to dream that far. As if the dog had heard Ted's silent plea, it didn't appear anywhere. The girl, visibly worried, kept anxiously turning her head and looking out for her pet. "Don't worry," Ted reassured her. "We'll find your dog. It just needs a bit of time. She ran past me so quickly I barely had a chance to see her. Stay calm, and we'll search this place methodically." "Thank you," the girl replied politely, brushing a thick strand of shiny brown hair from her forehead. "This isn't even my dog, which makes it twice as scary. A friend of mine asked me to walk her dog while she and her boyfriend were at the country club. They don't allow pets there, so I took Bera out for a walk. And she ran away. What am I going to say when my friend gets back? What am I going to do?" "We'll find Bera," Ted reassured with a frown, ready to do whatever it took to bring back the missing dog and to see the stranger smile. For half an hour, the young people scoured the park, searching beneath every bush, tree, and bench, but the dog in pink overalls was nowhere to be found. It was as if the dog had vanished. Ted was about to start asking the passers-by, but they seemed oblivious to the pet scurrying past. Eventually, after pacing back and forth along the park's paths in anxious silence, a flash of pink caught their eye in the distance. The dog was sitting near the fence separating the park from the street. She appeared tired and out of breath, but otherwise unharmed. As Ted approached the dog, Bera suddenly darted between the bars of the fence. The woman cried out in dismay, but Ted's response was instantaneous. He sprinted towards the fence and, with a few long strides, hoisted himself over it, leaving the young woman in stunned silence. The dog, tired and unprepared for pursuit, was easy to catch. She was clearly exhausted from her lengthy romp through the park. Ted held his precious catch tightly in his hands, rushing towards the gate situated further down the street. Holding Bera in his arms, he agonized over how to initiate a conversation with her temporary caretaker. What could he say to her? He didn't want to just let her go. He had been smitten at first sight, an experience he had never encountered before. The thought that this might be the elusive love everyone spoke about flashed through his mind. But would this wonderful beauty want to communicate with him? A simple guy from a dysfunctional family? And if she would, wouldn't she throw him away and ridicule him if he dared to hint at his feelings? "Here's your Bera," Ted said, handing the cherished dog over to the young woman who had obediently waited for him at the spot where they had parted. "Thank you so much. You've really saved me. You have no idea how much my friend loves this dog. She's like a family member to her," the woman said, taking the trembling pet and looping the surrounding leash in her slender, aristocratic palm. It took Ted a long time to pluck up the courage to say what he wanted to say. He felt that this captivating stranger was about to turn and disappear from his life forever, and he would be left alone, regretting the missed opportunity to express his feelings and reminiscing about the moments they shared. So he decided to speak. "My name is Ted," he announced, extending his hand. "Nice to meet you. I'm Allison." "Thank you, Ted, from the bottom of my heart. What would I have done without you?" she replied, her gray eyes twinkling with mischief. "Oh, it's not the first time I've chased dogs," Ted quickly responded, regretting his choice of words as it might reveal his past as a dog walker. "Do you have a dog too?" she inquired, glancing up at him. He found it difficult to look away from her. Instead of confessing his lack of pets, Ted fabricated a story about walking his friend's dogs. "You must be a very kind man," Allison said, clutching Bera. "Not everyone would care for pets that aren't theirs." Ted laughed and delicately reminded the young woman that she was probably just like that too, running around with a leash and a dog instead of spending time in more suitable company. Actually, he wished to tell her that a beauty like her ought to be spending time with a beau, but he refrained from saying so. Now they were both engaged in casual conversation. Ted's dream had come true. He had met this girl and was beginning to get to know her. Allison conversed easily and openly, showing no discomfort in the presence of a stranger despite the economic disparity between them. She was approachable, pleasant, and honest, engaging in any discussion without bragging or rushing to leave. Ted was unsure if it was gratitude for the saved pet or simply Allison's personality. She revealed that she was in her 4th year of university, training to be an international lawyer. She found her studies enjoyable and straightforward. She nonchalantly mentioned her upcoming winter vacation at a ski resort with her family as if it were as commonplace as a trip to the local bakery. To Ted, who had never ventured outside of the city, let alone overseas, her life seemed extraordinary. While Ted listened to Allison, he realized deep down that she wouldn't agree to meet him again. They were worlds apart. A single act of saving a dog wouldn't close the gap between their economic statuses. Ted shared little about himself. He mentioned his mother and an older brother who lived separately, and that he was self-employed, earning a living and paying rent. He didn't reveal his unemployment, hinting vaguely at the construction skills and various odd jobs. He aimed to keep Allison's attention for as long as he could. Allison and Ted strolled to the park's end, where steps led up to the street. The young woman held Bera, who was now calm and confident, closer in her arms, ready to bid farewell to Ted. "Thank you," Allison said sincerely. "You've been a great help. I don't know what I would have done without you. How could I have found Bera? Good luck, Ted." However, Ted couldn't bear to part with her just yet. He didn't know what it would take to transform their accidental acquaintance into a romance, but he wanted to keep her in his sight. Summoning his courage, Ted suggested they meet again at their convenience to walk Bera together. "What if she escapes and runs away again?" he added, immediately feeling foolish. If Allison had deciphered his intention to see her again, she didn't reveal it. She warmly agreed to Ted's suggestion, mentioning that she usually walks the dog after her studies around 4:30 in the afternoon. They could meet the next day at the same place and time if he didn't change his mind. Allison bid goodbye to the young man and left the park with Bera, leaving Ted alone and smiling foolishly after her. For their next meeting, Ted prepared meticulously. He hoped it would be a proper date. He critically reviewed his wardrobe, neatly groomed himself, and spritzed on some inexpensive cologne from Better Times. He admired his reflection in the mirror. If he had more money, he would have bought flowers and taken Allison to a cafe, but his pockets were empty, and he wasn't sure how she would react to flowers from a man who had just walked her dog. What if Allison was merely mocking him and didn't plan on showing up? Doubts gnawed at Ted. He wondered if he should have asked for her phone number to ensure he wouldn't lose her. Yet he also thought he had made the right call, as she might have refused to give him her number. Had that happened, he wouldn't have had the anticipation of their meeting to look forward to. Allison arrived punctually, appearing even more beautiful to Ted than the previous day. She was dressed in a bright pink tracksuit, which made her look like a beautiful flower. Ted went out of his way to please and impress her. He shared anecdotes and stories from his life, even inventing and embellishing some, all to make her smile and laugh as they walked together. Inwardly, Ted hoped that the unpredictable Bera would break free and run away. This would give him another chance to prove his usefulness to Allison. However, it seemed that Bera, tired from the previous day's events, walked peacefully and quietly. The evening walk passed swiftly, and it was time for the young people to part ways. Ted knew this moment would come, but he hadn't anticipated it would arrive so quickly. It felt as if he had just met Allison in the park with Bera on a leash, and now it was already time to say goodbye. "I haven't laughed this much in such a long time," Allison said earnestly, standing beside Ted. "Thank you for this wonderful evening. It's the best time I've had in ages." Ted struggled to find the right words to respond. If he let his emotions speak, he would have a list of compliments for Allison. He wanted to tell her how beautiful she was, how pleasant her company was, how intelligent she was, and how she made him feel like the happiest man in the world. But he held back, fearing he might scare her with his feelings. All he dared to do was invite her to meet him again at the same place and time the next day. "Well," Allison said seriously, "it seems Bera is getting used to you. She doesn't run away, and I feel safer with you." So they started seeing each other regularly. Every day after her studies, Allison would leash her dog and go to the park where Ted was waiting. To make it on time, Ted had to leave his part-time job early, earning less than he would have liked. But nothing could stop him. They enjoyed each other's company, and within 5 to 6 days, these walks became a habit. But all good things must come to an end. The time of Allison's friend's stay at the country club had come to an end. She was to return the next day. So Ted, Allison, and Bera, on a leash, took their final stroll under the old linden trees along the park's main path. "It's strange to think I won't have to rush home from the university to walk the dog tomorrow," the young woman shared her thoughts. "Don't you want to get your own dog?" Ted asked without much hope. "No," the girl laughed. "With my lifestyle, I can't own a dog. I'd finish the semester and then go on vacation with my parents. I couldn't abandon a pet like that, and it's not possible to bring a dog everywhere. So for now, I won't have any pets." Ted had so much he wanted to say. He was ready to care for her dog indefinitely, and she could trust him in any situation, not just with a pet. He even wanted to declare his love for her, but he valued this earnest girl with gray eyes too much to risk disclosing his feelings. Twilight had settled in as the young pair strolled along the lantern-lit alleys. It was time to head home, a path they both knew well. Suddenly, Ted, realizing that Allison might be leaving him for the last time, decided to ask for her phone number to keep in touch. He asked with such seriousness that she understood his intentions. For a few tense moments, she seemed lost in thought before promptly providing her number. Ted could barely express his gratitude before Allison waved goodbye and hurried home. From that moment, Ted's life was dominated by the anticipation of seeing Allison again, his dream girl. Countless times he held his phone, intending to call or text her, but he always hesitated, setting the device aside. He wondered about their potential relationship. Who were they to each other? Could they be together if Allison wanted it, or was it even worth trying? 3 days passed before he messaged her. His message was casual, simply asking how she was and what she was doing. To his surprise, Allison replied quickly, saying she was studying. So they had started a lively correspondence. Later, Ted suggested to Allison that they meet in the park for a stroll, to which she agreed. That day, he was the happiest man in the world. Their meetings became regular, and although they didn't explicitly discuss love, they both enjoyed spending time together. Allison learned a lot about Ted, her faithful friend and conversationalist, and wasn't deterred by his financial situation. Ted, in turn, fell more in love with Allison each day as he uncovered the nuances of her character and behavior. Ted realized they were growing attached to each other, which, given their circumstances, might not have been the best choice. However, he couldn't help his feelings. Every time he looked at Allison, his heart leapt, and the world around him seemed brighter and more beautiful. The time when Allison was supposed to go on vacation with her parents was approaching. The girl was finishing her last exams. There was only one left when suddenly there was a significant accident, if not to say disaster. "I broke my leg," cried Allison into the phone, calling Ted at an unusually late hour. Ted realized that for the first time Allison truly needed his help, so he promptly took matters into his own hands. 30 minutes after her call, he excused himself from work and rushed to the emergency room where Allison was taken directly from the university. As it turned out, Allison was walking to a teacher's counseling session but did not notice a dangerous patch of ice, slipped on it, and landed unluckily. She was given a plaster cast and advised to stay off her foot as much as possible. Going to the university was now out of the question. Allison had to figure out how to get home. She ordered a cab through an app, and Ted carried her to the car. It was clear to both of them that Allison couldn't get into the apartment without Ted's help, so the young woman invited him to come with her. Thus, Ted visited her home for the first time. That same evening, Ted met Allison's parents. They arrived from work as early as possible, excited by their daughter's call. Through Allison, Ted learned that her mother owns a beauty salon in the city center, while her father leads a large firm. Ted was anxious about this meeting, fearing that Allison's parents might forbid him from seeing her. However, to his surprise, the meeting went smoothly. They didn't insult or offend him. Instead, they repeatedly thanked him for helping their daughter. Once the initial shock about Allison's injury subsided, her parents started discussing her studies. They were unsure whether she could attend the university exam the day after tomorrow, or if she would need to take sick leave and request a later exam date. This was a complicated issue until Ted stepped in without hesitation. He offered to assist Allison. He would leave work for a few hours each day to pick her up, take her to university, help her navigate around, and then take her home. His offer was accepted unanimously, and Allison's parents once again expressed their delight at what a good young man had appeared by their daughter's side. On that same evening, lying in bed, Ted realized his initial fear of meeting Allison's parents was unfounded. Despite being wealthy, they were humble and down to earth. He enjoyed his interaction with them, and this gave him the confidence to plan for his future. He wondered if it was time to confess his feelings to Allison. Seeing the positive response from Allison's parents, Ted felt more grounded and energized. He happily helped Allison commute to university, got her home after her exam, and then hurried off to work. His efforts did not go unnoticed, as Allison's parents invited him for Sunday dinner. Ted was anxious before the dinner, but the atmosphere was just as relaxed as his usual interactions with Allison. Everyone joked, laughed, and shared interesting stories, with no one making fun of his modest clothing. Mrs. Smolders played a key role in creating this pleasant atmosphere. She showed genuine interest in Ted's work and family and truly admired his accomplishments. Mr. Smers spoke more about himself. He was a medium-built, self-confident, and sturdy man, often casting an evaluating yet approving gaze at Ted. Allison later revealed that her father was an orphan and, thanks to his innate cunning and skilled hands, he managed to achieve much in life. He valued people with tenacity. Feeling confident, Ted began to speak more assertively about his future with Allison, planning as though they were already a devoted couple. Knowing her parents' positive opinion of him, Ted was no longer apprehensive. He believed he could accomplish great things. When Allison's parents went on ski vacation, they left their daughter in the city, since because of the injury, skiing was out of the question for Allison for a long time. But they entrusted Ted with the responsibility of looking after Allison, and he diligently kept his promise, making sure Allison was never alone for long. Together they watched movies, ate pizza delivered to their home, played board games, and dreamt. In short, they had as much fun as Allison's leg would permit. Toward the end of the first week without their parents, Ted and Allison engaged in a late-night candid discussion about their interpretations of love. It was then that Ted confessed his feelings to Allison, fearing it was a risky and difficult conversation. He did not know for sure how Allison would react to his revelation, as the girl may well have taken his attention for sincere friendship. But Allison only looked at Ted with her shining eyes and, without hesitation, confessed her reciprocal feelings. At that moment, Ted was the happiest man on the planet, knowing his love was returned. The young couple sat hugging each other under a plaid blanket until the evening, making plans and dreaming, and dreaming. Their dreams were endless. Since that evening, Ted had literally started flying. To date, Allison was like on wings, and the girl reciprocated him completely, reciprocating his feelings. Allison and Ted got married the following January. Initially, family life delighted Ted, especially since his father-in-law disapproved of Ted's low-profit, unpretentious job and offered him a chance to join the family business. Although Ted lacked the necessary knowledge, acumen, and experience, his father-in-law believed these could be acquired. The key was to adapt quickly, make predictions, and remember vast amounts of information. Ted became the head of one of the company's subdivisions. As an inexperienced specialist, he was immediately supported by an advisor with significant experience in the field. This mentor guided him on decisions, and without him, Ted would have likely struggled in his first month. However, with the advisor's help, the subdivision performed better than ever. For the first time in his life, Ted was content with his salary and working conditions. He no longer had to rise at dawn, deal with dust and dirt, or spend half his day outside in any weather. He now worked in a spacious, clean, and bright office equipped with air conditioning and a coffee machine. He no longer worried about rent or what to have for dinner. His loving wife was always waiting for him at home. What else could Ted dream of? Living with Allison under one roof in the apartment given to them by her parents was a dream come true. The young couple spent a lot of time together after Allison returned from her studies and Ted from work. They always enjoyed each other's company and never grew bored. Allison was already pregnant by her last year of university. She and Ted didn't wait for her to start her career and gain work experience. Instead, they immediately began planning for the next generation of their family. Ted was eager to become a father and provide for his child what he lacked in his own childhood. Their first child was a girl. Ted did his best to show enthusiasm about being a father to a little princess. However, deep down, he realized that he had hoped for a boy. The man wanted to raise a son who would remind him of himself, a worthy member of society. The daughter they had was very similar to her mother, with the same thoughtful gray eyes, smile, and charming dimples on her cheeks. In a word, Ted was happy and proud to have such a wife and daughter. But deep down, he still felt something was missing. Life with a baby under the same roof was no longer the same. Allison was now mostly preoccupied with the child, leaving Ted feeling less involved. Ted, like many other young fathers, noted himself that now he had more time to devote to the household, as well as to his young daughter, who grew up to be quite a screaming and active child. He sometimes started to stay late at work purposely. Although he finished his tasks, he would wait for Allison to bathe their daughter and put her to bed. Once he returned home, he used to tenderly kiss his usually sleeping daughter's forehead and hope for some alone time with his wife. However, Allison always had chores to do, unloading the washing machine, running the vacuum cleaner, or tidying up. When his wife asked him to help with these tasks, Ted rarely agreed. He believed that Allison, being on maternity leave, should handle the household chores while he dealt with the exhaustion from his day filled with social interaction. Along with this, Ted appreciated that Allison never complained about him to his parents, even though her parents might have condemned his behavior. Allison remained silent, so Ted was grateful to his wife for her tolerance of his minor flaws and her discretion in keeping their disagreements private. Around the same time, Ted's mother reappeared and required his help. She had long given up on him and had no expectations until her son told her that he had gotten married and that he and his young wife would live in the apartment of her parents. Ted's mother, a shrewd woman, quickly perceived the benefits of his match, given her daughter-in-law's parents' wealth. When she was invited to get acquainted with Allison, she immediately paid attention to the new car that Ted now used to drive and the comfortable lifestyle he now enjoyed. Although she was glad at the birth of her granddaughter, her joy was somewhat insincere. Now she called Ted again and again to ask for money. Most of her pleas were not for herself but for her eldest son, who had recently left prison and was now a burden to her, incessantly drinking day and night. At first, Ted used to give money, even though with a heavy heart, but soon he realized that he just did not want to support his brother, who did not try to improve his own life in any way, but only wanted to take. The constant emotional pressure and his mother's manipulation did not contribute to his satisfaction with life. His daughter was growing up, and Ted increasingly found himself longing for a son. He couldn't always articulate how a baby daughter differed from a baby son in his mind, but he simply wanted a son. Ted had discussed this desire with Allison several times. However, his wife, who had undergone an emergency cesarean section during childbirth, repeatedly told Ted that it was not the right time to plan for a second child. Sometimes it seemed to Ted that he was literally going crazy at the thought of having a son, a successor of the family, and a proud bearer of his surname. Envy filled him when he saw his friends with their sons, and even men on the street pushing strollers with boys. Yet Allison remained steadfast. Now Ted seldom found the peace of sleep he used to enjoy. When he first met and dated Allison, his responsibilities often kept him awake until late at night. Allison sometimes openly resented the little time he gave to her and their daughter, but the man always justified it by saying that he worked hard for the good of their family. For her part, Allison tried as carefully as possible to keep order in their apartment, to give the necessary attention to her husband, to raise their daughter, to cook exquisite dishes, and so on. The woman sincerely wanted her feelings with Ted to be as fresh and bright as when they had just met and liked each other. Yet she could see the toll that their domestic life and his desire for a son was taking on Ted. This obsession of his discouraged both Allison and her parents, to whom the woman finally revealed a little about the problems in her family. Mr. Smers couldn't understand why a daughter was less desirable than a son, and Alina advised their daughter not to dwell on this unjust bliss. Finally, Allison assertively promised to her husband that they would indeed aim to have a boy, but only after their older daughter had grown up. Ted, with a heavy heart, had to accept his wife's standpoint on this matter. He loved Allison and respected her as a reliable life partner, so he did not want to instigate an argument over this issue. Despite this, he yearned for a son. Their second pregnancy occurred 2 years after the first, unplanned as the young couple had let their guard down. A month later, Allison revealed to her husband the 2 vivid stripes on the pregnancy test. Ted, filled with satisfaction, began to shower his wife with care and attention. He started spending more time on cooking and other household chores, even taking over some of Allison's responsibilities. He became involved in raising their daughter and eagerly anticipated the second ultrasound like a child on Christmas Eve. Ted dreamed of having a son and couldn't even imagine the idea of having another daughter. However, the second ultrasound made him nervous as the baby turned away from the machine and crossed its leg. Ted, having read on the internet that such behavior is more common for boys, proudly boasted about it for weeks. That was until Allison went for another ultrasound and the doctor revealed that they were having another daughter. Ted's disappointment was palpable. He seemed crestfallen and even turned pale. Allison was torn. She felt it was wrong for Ted to be so affected by the fact that they would have a girl, yet she couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Meanwhile, Ted's significant emotional estrangement from his wife and daughter began with this unpleasant episode. Although everything seemed fine outwardly, Allison sensed that something was off. It was as if she did not meet the expectations of her husband to be able to give him a long-awaited son, and therefore she had to live with the feeling of her inferiority all the time. Ted was well aware that his high position and luxurious lifestyle were due to his wife and his in-laws. He didn't want his father-in-law to learn about his behavior, so he maintained a respectful exterior. But he was simply discouraged by the thought that it was not known whether they would have a third child and whether he would be a boy. Ted was truly terrified that he would have to raise 2 girls, and that he would not be able to realize himself as a full-fledged man. A phone call from his mother was the final straw. She informed him that his older brother's girlfriend was pregnant with a boy and asked her youngest son to help with the money for a mortgage for the happy parents-to-be. For the first time in his life, Ted yelled at his mother and firmly dismissed her request. Let him not count on help, not a penny here. That's all. If he could father a child, he should be able to provide for him. Ted ended the call abruptly and burst into tears like a young child. He couldn't comprehend why the thought of having a male heir was so consuming. He had everything: a beautiful wife, a healthy daughter, another child on the way, money, societal status, a home, yet it wasn't enough. Ted yearned for a son, a desire as fervent as a toddler's insistence for a toy at the store. Ted realized he was dissatisfied with all he had achieved so far. Allison seemed less attractive. Running their business became monotonous, and his father-in-law's constant inquiries about the firm and his involvement in contracts, through his confidence, frustrated Ted further. The birth of their second healthy and beautiful daughter didn't exhilarate Ted too much. While his wife was in the hospital and their daughter was with her grandparents, Ted found solace in the arms of another woman. Now it seemed to him that Allison, as if on purpose mocking him, giving birth to 2 girls, and he, as a healthy young man, has every right to be happy. Ted made every effort to conceal his double life. He was always gentle with his wife, loving with his children, and diligent at work. However, under the guise of flimsy pretexts, he would disappear for a few hours into a nondescript hotel, emerging a different man. Occasionally, he feared that someone, particularly his father-in-law, might discover his secret amusements. At those moments, he would pause his escapades for a few days. He also knew Allison would not forgive him for his indiscretions, especially since she herself was just so perfect a wife and life partner. However, the urge to be more than just a son-in-law of a wealthy man always resurfaced, and he would find himself back at the same hotel. The children were growing up, but their father remained indifferent. Though he could smile broadly at the photo shoots his wife arranged for Christmas, or their daughters' birthdays, the thought that he didn't have sons constantly lingered in the back of his mind. And then one day, Ted's assistant was hospitalized due to appendicitis, and the most qualified employee of another department was sent to replace her. Kristen was tall, young, and slender, immediately capturing Ted's attention. She was so captivated that he lost himself in her presence. Despite her youth, Kristen was experienced and knowledgeable. She had recently turned 29 and had been a widow for 6 months after her husband died in a car accident. She was known as a competent employee who could handle any difficult situation. Ted found Kristen's characteristics highly appeasing, both for his personal life and work. However, he was unsure how to approach this elegant woman who greeted him each morning with impeccably styled hair, a perfectly ironed suit, a warm smile, and a cup of coffee. Ted would give half his remaining life just to ask Kristen one simple question: would she be his? But alas, asking such a question and revealing himself meant losing his job and his family if Kristen chose to report his claim. So Ted only continued to gaze longingly at his new secretary, not making any hasty actions. Allison had lost her mysterious and feminine allure in his eyes long ago. She moved around the house in nothing but a tracksuit, her hair not neatly arranged but twisted into a tight bun. This had grown increasingly annoying to Ted after the birth of their first daughter, but now it was a grand disaster. Besides, she was constantly busy with the children and could only talk about children, while Ted thought that he needed a worthy interlocutor with whom he could discuss not only diapers, porridge, and development centers, which Allison took her daughters to. Kristen, on the other hand, was entirely different, flexible, seductive, and enigmatic. She was the ideal he yearned for, someone he could lose himself in without a backward glance. Ted felt that for a joyful life, he should have met Kristen earlier instead of Allison. The vibrant brunette Kristen, with her searing brown eyes, made Allison, a light and blonde woman, seem dull in comparison. Kristen drew attention wherever she went, making every man on the street turn to look at her, including Ted. He felt as if he was not his own anymore, his thoughts constantly consumed by the enchantress who was always around yet always out of reach. An invisible wall seemed to stand between them, and it was a wall of fear. Ted was genuinely afraid that Kristen, being an experienced employee, would immediately report his intentions to his father-in-law. But even this fear could not stop Ted from thinking and desiring about Kristen. Her eyes were always in his mind, even during intimate moments with his wife. He felt completely obsessed and powerless against it. Every time Kristen brought him documents to sign, stood beside him, laughed, or conversed in his presence, Ted lost control. Just 6 months ago, if someone had suggested that he could become so infatuated with a woman, he would have laughed in their face. But there was nothing funny about this current situation. Ted was completely in love. Kristen seemingly ignored his innuendos, and the way her boss's breathing quickened when she entered his office. She was comfortable around everyone, him, his deputies, and the rest of the staff. She was confident and easygoing with everybody, which irritated Ted. He found himself jealous of Kristen despite her not being his, and unaware of his feelings towards her. In addition to this, Kristen was intelligent and educated. Colleagues from other departments sought her advice, and she knew how to organize work efficiently and spot mistakes. She seemed content with her life, which Ted found appealing, compared to his often gloomy and dissatisfied wife, who complained that he didn't help with their daughters. Kristen dressed expensively and tastefully, wore good shoes, and, as Ted overheard, frequented high-end beauty salons. This certainly enhanced her appearance, making her glow and blossom. More than one person would turn their heads when she walked down the corridors, carrying files full of papers. Ted spent 2 weeks in a state of obsession over Kristen. Realizing that he couldn't continue like this, her face appeared to him everywhere, and he even mistakenly called Allison by Christine's name a few times. He had experienced infatuations before, but none had ever taken the form of obsessions. Ted decided he had to act. He was determined to win Kristen over, no matter the cost. After all, he saw risk-taking as a noble pursuit. Besides, his permanent secretary was going to return from sick leave soon, which would mean returning Kristen to her previous position. Ted feared he might run out of time to establish a relationship with her. Starting the conversation terrified Ted, but he knew it was necessary. He waited until they were alone in the office on a Friday when all other employees left early. He purposely stayed late as a diligent secretary. Christine couldn't leave until her boss did. She remained sitting at her workplace, organizing the newly signed documents into files. Ted invited Kristen to his office and, barely restraining his excitement, offered her to have coffee with him. Just because they had been working together for 2 weeks and still hadn't gotten to know each other. Kristen's dark eyes sparked with a teasing expression, prompting Ted to quickly adopt a serious demeanor. However, in her presence, he felt himself melt like butter under a hot knife. After enjoying coffee laced with a splash of fine brandy, they moved on to wine that Ted had saved for such an occasion, leading to candid conversations. Kristen was sitting across from him, her leg draped over the other, and Ted was convinced that she was wearing stockings, not the typical pantyhose his wife wore. It was a thought that drove him to distraction, making it difficult to focus on their conversation. Finally, unable to endure the tantalizing proximity without the possibility of growing closer, he gently covered Kristen's hand with his own. She lifted her eyes to meet his and then quickly looked away. At that moment, Ted stopped all thought. He leaned in and kissed her, not in the way he kissed his wife, but rather swiftly, sharply, and instantly, as if his life depended on it. To Ted's surprise, Kristen didn't pull away. Instead, she sighed lightly and pressed herself against him, clinging to his torso like a weary traveler finding water in the desert. In the quiet of his study, Ted could only feel the pounding of his heart and hear his own blood rushing in his ears. When their lips finally parted and Christine pulled away, seemingly regretting her momentary lapse, Ted pleaded, "Don't tell me it was a mistake and it won't happen again." "It was wonderful," Kristen whispered sincerely with her dark, enticing eyes. "But you are married." A moan escaped from Ted, speaking more eloquently to Kristen than her words ever could. Once again, he drew her close, buried his face in her hair, and relished the scent of her skin and the subtle curves of her wrists, neck, and shoulders. When Ted returned home, he was sullen and silent. He didn't want to interact with his children, who had become a mere source of irritation for him, or his wife. He didn't want to see anything or anyone around him except for her, Kristen. Allison wanted to ask her husband a lot of difficult questions. For instance, why was he late? Would he go to the store? Could he take the youngest to the clinic instead of her, since she was going to a parent-teacher conference at their eldest daughter's school? He felt she was merely mocking him. What clinic? What meeting when he was so consumed by his feelings for her? Ted quickly excused himself with a headache and retreated to the kitchen, where he began to reflect over a shot of whiskey. He understood perfectly well that Allison would not forgive his betrayal and he would lose everything: his daughter's wife and house. However, all that seemed insignificant to him. His mind was dominated by her, Kristen, charming and seductive. A powerful magnetism drew him towards her, a pull he did not want to resist. He thought about her every minute, dreamed about her, was inspired by her. He had never imagined that such powerful, compelling feelings could exist. The next day, Ted informed his wife that he would be visiting the new branch after work. He didn't fear lying about this because he knew he would indeed be visiting the new branch, though with Kristen. What he didn't tell his wife was that he had already found a nice apartment to rent nearby. Kristen was comfortable with how her relationship with her new boss was progressing. She occasionally asked him about the potential consequences if his wife discovered their affair. However, Ted avoided thinking about it. Instead, he focused on making Kristen feel special, often showering her with outfits, jewelry, and other lavish gifts. Despite his generosity, Ted was frustrated that Kristen wasn't entirely his. He fantasized about her becoming his wife, replacing his current neglected spouse. However, Kristen refused to entertain this idea. She was clear that she was more interested in receiving gifts and enjoying their relationship rather than dealing with domestic responsibilities. Ted was disheartened by this, but he hoped that with time Kristen would come to love him as much as he loved her and eventually agree to marry him. Ted and Kristen no longer worked directly together, as Ted's permanent secretary had returned to her job. Ted regretted this situation, fearing that other men might attract Kristen. Whenever he voiced his concern or accusations, Kristen would laugh them off, stating that Ted could not control her every move. The woman valued independence and money above all else, and she was not shy to share these beliefs with Ted. However, Ted chose to ignore them, thinking that Kristen was just protecting herself from loving him too much. Meanwhile, tension was escalating at home. Allison grew tired of her husband's indifference. He would often wander aimlessly around the house, paying little attention to her, their children, or household affairs. Perhaps it was a female instinct or a sixth sense, but Allison sensed the reason for her husband's coldness. They were living almost separately, each in their own room. Allison was solely responsible for the children. In fact, Ted could not even name the school his older daughter attended or the kindergarten his younger child was in, as he had never visited either in all these years. Allison pondered for a long time, unable to make up her mind. At times, she believed that everyone lived like this and that there was no need to exacerbate the situation. Yet the thought of what their future held worried her. She was young, she had just turned 30, and she wondered how Ted would support and care for her and the children in the future if even now he was behaving so disgustingly. Allison didn't share these thoughts with anyone, as she lacked a confidant. Discussing it with her parents was out of the question. Her father would be quick to retaliate against anyone who offended his daughter. So Allison had to make her own decision, and she did. She simply decided she had had enough of Ted and his half-hearted involvement in their family life. Allison didn't know how low Ted had fallen or how low he would fall. She had no idea that her husband's news was now another woman, so she thought that her decision would be met with the toughest possible resistance from Ted. Nevertheless, one day she just gathered her husband's belongings and placed them in the stairwell. Returning from what appeared to be work but was actually a rendezvous with his mistress, Ted was in for an unpleasant surprise. At first, the man didn't know what to do. He considered begging Allison to take him back, confessing everything and changing for the sake of their children. But then he realized the situation might be for the best. Now, nothing would interfere with his happiness, and he could be with the woman he truly loved. Mendelssohn's march in his head, Ted quickly took his suitcases and headed for the door, dialing Kristen's number on the way. He couldn't wait to tell her they would finally be together. However, despite Ted's joy, Kristen was not thrilled about their new reality. She merely took advantage of him as long as he had money for lavish gifts and costly cosmetic procedures. She was well aware of her role, a high-class predator and hunter of others' wealth, not a domesticated house cat burdened with household chores. She had no desire for children or to live with Ted. While he dreamed naively, she used to indulge him, drawing him deep into her web. However, now that his father-in-law, the actual head of the company, was likely to dismiss Ted or cut off his lucrative salary, he was no longer valuable to her. Nonetheless, she suspected he still had some resources left, and it made sense to stick around for a while. Kristen was right about Ted being out of the company in the near future. The news seemed to come as a surprise to Ted. He didn't seem to realize that everything he had been using freely was not his, nor did he consider the potential consequences of his actions. The day after Ted eagerly left for his new life, he was denied entry to the office by the security service, and all his corporate cards were blocked. His luxury SUV, which he had used as a top manager of the company, was towed away. It seemed the tow truck had been waiting nearby, and while Ted was arguing with the security guards inside the office, his vehicle was loaded onto the truck. By the time he ran out of the building, he could only watch as his car was towed away around the distant corner. The man didn't perceive it as the end of the world. After all, he had Kristen and she had him. They would undoubtedly overcome whatever came their way. Ted, having topped up his card the previous day, called a cab to visit his lover. But at that time, Kristen was at work, so he had to wait for her outside her apartment as she hadn't yet given him a key. When Kristen returned from work, she made a capricious face and wished to be right now in a fancy restaurant where they once liked to go. For the first time, Ted thought that his funds wouldn't last long at this rate, but he couldn't deny his beloved's simple request. After dinner, they spent the evening lounging on the couch. Kristen flatly refused to discuss their future together until Ted came up with a way to take money from tomorrow. This put Ted in a tough spot, and he spent a long time considering their options. He realized they had enough funds for a couple more weeks of this leisurely lifestyle. After that, he would need to find work or face financial hardship. But his father-in-law would not let him earn money in his social circle, that much was clear. So only the former low-qualified options, such as construction work, were available to him. The realization of the predicament Kristen had put him in hit Ted hard, but Kristen seemed unconcerned. 2 more agonizing and turbulent days passed. Each morning, Christine would unceremoniously kick Ted, her unfortunate lover, out of her apartment. This left him feeling humiliated, but he had nowhere else to go. In the evening, she would remind him that since she was devoting time to him, he needed to reciprocate with gifts. As such, she acquired a rejuvenation treatment for her décolletage and a beautiful golden ring. When Ted confessed that he was out of money, Kristen simply smiled and reassured him, "The morning is wiser than the evening. We'll sort this out tomorrow." He only understood her meaning the next day when she told him she wasn't running a charity for the unemployed. With the words, "You can't afford a woman like me," she kicked him out, instructing him to leave her alone and not obstruct her search for a new wealthy suitor. Feeling utterly defeated and hopeless, Ted rented a bed in a hostel and began to get by on odd jobs. Now, the man deeply regretted his decision to be swayed by Kristen, but it was too late to turn back. His memories of Allison were now painted exclusively in a positive light, just as in the early days of their relationship. He no longer dwelled on her habit of wearing a tracksuit at home or choosing pantyhose over stockings. Instead, he remembered Allison's cooking skills, her care for their children, and her ability to tend to his needs without demanding more than he could provide. In short, now he finally noticed that she was the perfect wife. One sunny Sunday afternoon, a few months after their breakup, he went to the same park where they had first met. It felt like a lifetime ago. The park hadn't changed much, except for some different flowers in the flower beds. He didn't spot Allison at first. Instead, he noticed their youngest daughter cheerfully shouting at her older sister while skating from the slide. As Ted watched them, he couldn't help but marvel at their beauty, noticing how much they resembled their mother. "Where is Allison? Why isn't she with the girls?" Ted scanned the crowd for the solitary woman among those seated on nearby benches, but there was no Allison to be found. He was about to reproach her for her frivolity when he found himself short of breath. Sitting next to his Allison was a man, a stranger who appeared a couple of years older than him, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, and amiable. He was smiling warmly at Allison, his arm casually draped around her shoulders. He pointed at the girls and shared the smile. Then the unthinkable happened. Their youngest daughter ran up to this strange man, thrust a bouquet of dandelions into his hand, and he, judging by his expression, thanked her warmly and kissed her on the head. Ted was devastated. So this was the kind of woman his wife was? She didn't even wait to grieve over her husband's leaving, whom she herself had ousted, before moving on to another. Ted couldn't bear to watch Allison's newfound familial bliss with this new man or see how he doted on their children. He simply turned and walked away. The man found himself with nowhere to go and nothing to live for. His former life as a wealthy man named Ted was now a distant memory. Once respected and valued, he was now seen as worthless in the job market. Initially, he harbored immense anger towards Allison and his in-laws, blaming them for his predicament. Not a shred of doubt could penetrate his cynicism. However, after enduring 6 months of abject poverty and solitude, it began to dawn on him that he was the root cause of his own misfortune. Then one day on Allison's friends page, the one Ted was signed to, there was a photograph of Allison and another man, both beaming, staring back at him. The caption read, "Dear Allison and Andre, congratulations on your marriage." "Happy years to you." Ted stared at it in disbelief, and at first he couldn't comprehend why the image seemed to wobble and blur. It was only when he tasted the saltiness of his tears that he understood everything.